The silence is quiet, and it feels like it's getting hard to breathe. And I know you feel like dying, but I promise we'll take the world to its feet. Ooh, mountains, bring it to its feet. Ooh, mountains. And I'll rise up, I'll rise like the day. I'll rise up, I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I'll do it 1,000 times again. All we need is hope. And for that we have each other. And for that we have each other. And we will rise, we will rise, we'll rise. Oh, we'll rise. I'll rise up, rise like the day. I'll rise up in spite of the age. I will rise 1,000 times again. And we'll rise up. I like the waves. We'll rise up. In spite of the ache, we'll rise up. And we'll do it 1,000 times again.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the space. So great to see all of you. I just love so many of these faces and ones that I haven't met yet, but I'm sure I will love. I'm Teresa. Just a quick note, we are going to be recording this session. So if you don't want to be on video, feel free to take your video off. Mostly it will be, the video will be pinned on Shameka and Janice and I as we go through, and we are recording now. So thank you, Shameka. And of course, my brain just goes out as soon as we start. So before we get started, I wanted to first just acknowledge my presence here on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Seminole and Timucua peoples in an area now known as DeLand, Florida. And Shameka Cunnigham is joining us today from Seattle, which is the traditional lands of the Duwamish people. Earlier today, as we were sort of preparing for this, Janice kindly shared another acknowledgement that came from Adrian Wong of Spiderweb Show in Ontario. And so I'm going to read that. Since our activities are shared digitally to the internet, let's also take a moment to consider the legacy of colonization embedded within the technologies, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We are using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many Indigenous communities. Even the technologies that are central to much of the art we make leave significant carbon footprints, contributing to changing climates that disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples worldwide. I invite you to join me in acknowledging all of this, as well as our shared responsibility to make good of this time, and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship. So thank you. A note about our time together. We're going to open Shameka is going to first lead us in a grounding meditation, and then we'll be moving into the conversation with Janice and I, and we will end by both Janice and I pulling some cards that will be a message to the community. So I would like to turn this over to Shameka.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all again for being here. I'm Shameka. And so I wanted to go ahead and get us all centered and grounded and present. So I'd like to invite everyone to take in a deep breath and let it out. And then this next time we take in a deep breath, I'd like you to take in or think about what it is that you need at this moment to feel your most grounded and present. Is that strength? Is that stillness, love? Just call in what you need and take that with you as you take your deep breath in and let it out on a count of 3. Okay, so let us think about what it is that we need at this moment, and let us take a deep breath in and let it out on a count of 3. 1, 2, 3. And we'll take 2 more grounding breaths before we begin. All right, one more time. Deep breath in. Let it out. And our last deep breath in. Let it out. And hold with you whatever it is, the word or that feeling that you said that you needed. I invite you to hold that with you as we go on to continue our conversation with Teresa and Janice. Again, thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Shameka. Okay, so a couple things first about these second Sundays conversation. So first of all, I just want to thank the Four Queens platform, Sela Satterstrom and Kristen Nelson, for hosting this. My intention when they told me that they were launching Four Queens, this idea sort of emerged really organically from a conversation with them. My intention for this series, which normally is held on the second Sunday, but because of stuff going on, we time warped to the fifth Sunday. But my intention with this is twofold. So first of all, to gather across disciplines, practices, and geographies in order to connect and build solidarity. You know, we are all magical beings. We are all the clairs working together. As our last guest, Amanda Yates Garcia, said, there's a process of re-enchanting the world through this gathering together. And part of that re-enchantment for me leads to the other reason, which has to do with that I feel like we're in such a state of spiritual crisis in our culture, in the world, and that this spiritual crisis is deeply connected to climate crisis. And by climate, I mean all of the systems of the environment, including systems of exploitation that would have us believe that we are no more than sort of homo economicus, like we're here to buy, sell, labor, that's it. And so part of my intention also with this series is to reclaim our spiritual and energetic body, to reclaim spiritual discourses, practices, and expressions. For those of you who know me and who know my work, you know that I was born into a fundamentalist or evangelical Christian household that was also Catholic. I have worked through a lot of questions about spiritual authority. I'm still deeply interested in them and still working through them. This series is in inviting a range of practitioners and visionaries across disciplines. This series sort of embodies the curiosity and wonder of my protagonist in my novel, The Reconception of Marie, like her questions about mystic saints and other kinds of belief systems the sort of curiosity and wonder that comes here as well. So I am super excited to have Janice Lee here with me today. And Janice, for those that don't know, and I think Shameka is going to be putting some bios and things like that in the chat, but Janice is the author of several books, Damnation, this one, I can't, like, I have them all here. I have them all here. Keratakis, which I remember hearing about her, that being picked up for publication and her working on it actually in my basement in Los Angeles. For any of you that, here's another one of Janice's books. For any of you that enjoyed Layfieg events in Los Angeles, especially the Layfieg auction, that was Janice and I's idea. Like, so I've known Janice for a long time. I am deeply, I love her so much. And she's now in Portland. I'm here in Florida. And just to kind of get started, I know that Janice, one of the things that you have been cultivating in the last several years is a kind of shamanistic practice, and you say that also on your bio, right? And so I'm curious just to hear first for you to sort of ground us and help us to understand, like, what does that mean? What has that been for you? Also, that word can sometimes be problematic, but I know that you're a very deep thinker and, very considerate about these things. So I would love to just hear about, have you start with your story in that regard.
Yeah. So a lot of this happened really recently for me, I think, in a more direct way, even though I think I've been indirectly kind of experiencing this all my life. So I mean, my whole life I was always really drawn to animals. I communicated with animals. It was a thing. Neighbors would ask me to come over and talk to their dogs so that they wouldn't bite the mailman. And so I think I always had that. And my mother always had strange dreams and visions, and we would sometimes share those. But as it happens, once I went to school and I went to college and read, too much Western philosophy, a lot of that kind of stopped coming, right? And so it was both me suppressing a lot of it because of kind of intellectual stuff, but also not noticing things in the same way. And I think a lot of that started returning after my mother died. And I think grief is something that does that. It kind of leaves you open and vulnerable in a way that lets you notice things. And it wasn't really until I moved to Portland that I became more open to a lot of these things that I'm doing now. I think there was a large part of my identity that I was clinging onto, like the intellectual self, that didn't want to engage directly in these things that I had a lot of preconceived notions about, right? And especially like being in LA, a lot of these things, there's you meet certain types of people who are interested in types of things, and then you make judgments and you're like, well, I'm not that kind of person, right? But like that was like another thing that I had to also shed, right? So I think one really like pivotal moment for me was I was connected to this person, Jane Ann Thomas, through my very good friend Nancy Romero, who had been pushing me to like meditate and communicate with trees like for a very long time. And I was like, yes, I know, Nancy, but I like wasn't fully immersed in it. I wasn't, for whatever reason, I was resistant to it. And I had this animal totem reading with Jane Ann Thomas that like broke open a lot of things for me. And it was both a really new experience because I hadn't ever had an experience like that before. And it was really, really familiar, just the way that she was talking to me. And, there were lots of different components where she was looking at my past lives, and Vedic astrology is also part of her practice. There were all of these things that were happening. And what I realized was like, I already knew a lot of this. It was very familiar, but I didn't know it in the way that I thought I knew it. So I started to kind of pursue a little bit more directly, exploring different tenets. I started exploring a little bit of my own heritage, Korean shamanism. Shamanism isn't quite the right word, right? But I, explored that. I explored a lot of Buddhist and Sufi texts. All of that is part of my practice. And then I came across my current teacher, Rosemary Beam, here in Portland, who
is a shaman in the Q'ero tradition of the Quechua speaking people in Peru and the Andes Mountains.
Hmm.
And, you know, I stumbled across it and I was drawn to it for a few different reasons, but as I started studying in it more formally, it felt very true to me, but it also felt just very familiar. And so it was both, felt like I was cultivating knowledge that was like already in my body somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of pushing me to really explore a lot of my resistances. And so a lot of things started to break open for me. And so, and that was like in many aspects of my life and in my relationships and in my teaching. And all of that kind of started to become related. And it totally influenced the way that I teach and interact with people too. And so I have this, you know, term shamanic healer in my bio.
Mm-hmm.
It's a term that I'm still not sure about, right? Um, I include it because I want to acknowledge that I'm not doing things in the conventional way, that there is a lot of this work is hugely integral now to my teaching practice and in my writing practice. But the term shamanism, like as many of us know, is a really problematic term. It's this term that like in the West we've used to kind of simplify almost all ancient indigenous practices around the world under this one umbrella term,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there's also, you know, there's schools of core shamanism in the West that people study that are also really problematic because it has this idea that you can just take these tenets of all of these cultures and just, you know, make them the same thing.
Right.
Yeah, which, you know, but I also don't know of another word that acknowledges this connection to this type of knowledge, right? That really is thinking, you know, it includes in the definition this practice of bringing healing and awareness. And that really is about collaboration with nature. And so to me, when I think of shamanism or shamanic healing, I'm not necessarily thinking about some of the kind of ways that we've portrayed them in the West, but I'm thinking really about like relationship to nature. And so for me, it's like cultivating relationship with plants, with animals, with the world, with everyone else. And that in that relationship, I'm learning new ways of being and becoming. And so as of yet, I don't know of a different word that kind of acknowledges both the history and, you know, I think what it's capable of. So I don't know, you know, I don't, there are other words like medicine worker. I don't know. There's a lot of words, but
Yeah.
they all don't feel right.
Right. No, I mean, I think that's fascinating. There's so many things that you've said that I just think are fascinating. Including, I was just reading the other day about animal empaths. Like that's actually a kind of, you know, empath that one can be, right? And, but I want to pick up on this. So you had said, um, that when you started, so Nancy Romero, who is an amazing writer, by the way, FYI, amazing person, check her out. But that when you started learning stuff, it was stuff that you knew, but you didn't know it like you thought you did. And then when you found the kind of path or tradition that felt right, it felt familiar. So I'm hearing kind of like an echo in that. And you know, I think I don't know if there's more that, you know, if there's more to say there around like what is it, I don't know, like what's, how do you know, how do you, like it seems like there's a lot of like actually learning how to trust your intuition. Um, and I know that for some of us, that can be something really challenging. I mean, like with the background I had in the kind of spiritual abuse, right? That it was actually like, you can't trust, like if you're seeing spirits, unless it's what we've said it is, then you're actually seeing demons. And that's because you've done something to let those demons into your life. Right. And so you learn to like, not trust your own knowing. So I guess I just want to hear a little bit about that process of like sort of learning to trust your own knowing or your own intuition.
Yeah, I mean, I think many of us were trained in different ways to not trust our knowings, right?
Mm.
For various reasons, from society, being, you know, being a woman, whatever, for many reasons, right? But I think that like what, you know, as I continued practicing, what I realized is like whenever I did actually trust my intuition, there's a knowing there that was much more rich and profound than anything that I could articulate with my intellectual self, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the difference for me in this kind of knowing is that like it's something that you can come to know, but it can't be articulated necessarily in
Mm.
language, right? And I think that's part of the challenge, is that once you actually try to articulate it in language, the danger is fixing it into a category, right? Oh, I saw this thing. Well, what did you see? Well, I think it was a ghost. And then so now I've fixed it with this word ghost, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Rather than just trusting that you saw this thing, it doesn't have to mean anything, right? I think there's like a burden of meaning making
Mm-hmm.
that we have, and that you can just kind of know it, know that you saw it, integrate it, and it's there, right? But it doesn't have to signify something. It doesn't have to be this means this thing, therefore you have to go do this thing. If that makes sense, right? Um,
Yeah.
but I think it's really hard. Like I think for me the hardest thing was I needed everything to mean something, right? Like I would analyze my dreams. I'm like, well, I dreamt this, what must mean that I am doing this, and you know, and it's like it can mean all of those things and it doesn't have to mean something that has to be narrativized in that way. uh,
Yeah. No, I'm just laughing because literally I was walking the other day and I was like, it's not that everything happens for a reason. It's that you can find meaning in everything that happens, right? But you can find like multiple meanings in everything that happens. Yeah. So no, that totally makes sense. So, you know, there's a few essays that we were you know, when I talked to you about this conversation before, that we, you know, you suggested that I revisit or read or revisit. And there's one that's actually on, I think it was written initially for a panel on codependencies, which I just, I don't know why. Sometimes it's just like things take whatever time they take to sort of seep in. And because of, you know, I just kept seeing like codependency, you know, as like this pathology, right? And you're actually like, you know, in this conversation with, I think some other people that are here in the Zoom space, like Brenda Ijima, hello, hi. You know, we're actually, you know, taking that term and talking about the side, the motivating factor actually around what might end up becoming a codependent in a harmful way or toxic way relationship, which is actually like being able to see, you know, actually being in deep connection with each other. And you talk about in that essay too about plants specifically, and how plants, like what you've learned about, or some of the things that you've learned about writing from plants and language from plants, but also how plants sort of create the space, like they create the space that they're in. Anyway, I would love to hear you talk more about about plants in this regard. Or
yeah.
yeah.
um I mean plants, so plants, so many things, right? I think when I think about plants, the first thing I think about is breath, right? Is they breathe for us and we
Mm-hmm.
breathe for them, right? And that creates a climate.
Mm-hmm.
I think about plants as um, beings that, for the most part, can't move, right? At least they don't move the way that we move. And so, if there's an obstacle, they can't just run away. They have to adapt in the spot that they're in. So change has to kind of come from within. It's internal. Um, and so those are some of the lessons I think about from plants. But I also really think about like the openness of plants. So like the leaves of plants are constantly open for the most part, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they have to absorb everything that's coming in, and sometimes that means that they're absorbing toxins. I think about like the fires that we had here in Portland, and you know, the garden outside, and they were just sitting there absorbing everything, and that was just what was happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
um, but what I think about in that is this lesson about permeability. And I know you talked about like this climate crisis at the beginning in
Mm-hmm.
the introduction, And for me, a lot of like the crisis around the climate and many other things, including climate change, is that it's not something that it's not something that can be contained, right? Like the climate crisis isn't a crisis that we can solve, because the climate isn't something that we can fix, because it's not a self-enclosed thing. It's entangled with everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a crisis that is separate from us. Like we also are the climate crisis, and we are climate change, and there's everything that we do is entangled with all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think when I think about like, you know, plants and moss in particular, I just had this conversation with Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's many of you have probably read, and she's a big you know, moss expert. And one of the things she talks about is like, it's always like moss plural, like you don't have a singular moss, there's always groups of them. And just the way that plants live, it's impossible to have a singular identity. It's always in community, always with each other. And I think that's something that's really hard for us to think about as humans, like especially in the West, where we emphasize the individual so much, right? And so that we forget that we're always, when we act upon something, we're also acting with, right? And we're changing everything anytime we encounter anything at all. And we become changed in that encounter. But it's always, we think about things as so much like subject object, like acting just the action upon. And it's not linear in that way, right? We're all constantly entangled. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. So how has that shifted your own approach to writing?
Yeah. Well, the most immediate effect is that I find it much harder to write now. Like I haven't written like almost at all in the past year. Like anything that I've published has either been from like in a very particular assignment or stuff that I wrote before. But I've been finding it very hard to write, actually, because I'm kind of questioning why I'm writing at all. Like what is it that I'm writing? What is it that I'm translating and trying to articulate, and like for what reason? Um, but I think about so my last project that I did finish, which is my novel that's coming out in the fall. What I was really thinking about was like, was this kind of idea of entanglement, right? And trying to show a landscape where like characters are entangled with each other, and that they're not necessarily protagonists, which includes like non-human characters, right? So there's like tomato plants and animals and dreams are also characters in the novel. But I also think a lot about language, and like that's something that I've been thinking about recently. Like I'm co-teaching this class with John Beer right now on grammar, which is very exciting. And like the whole
I wish I could take the class.
It's like, and like what the class is that like actually what we're doing is we're unlearning. Right? It's like it's a project of unlearning and realizing like that we're complacent in following all of these rules and systems that sometimes we don't know that we're following. And just because something has always been this way doesn't mean that we have to, right? And so we're learning all of these systems, but also figuring out like what are our own roles in those.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like almost like when I think about language, I think about both the body, right? So I think about literally the tongue, and that language is this biological thing, right? And then there's language as in writing, which is the translation from the body, from the tongue in onto page. And it's like, that's where grammar, not completely. I mean, we have, you know, these things that sort of govern spoken speech as well. But it does seem like, you know, that there's this question of like, how do you honor the body? How do you honor that tongue that is speaking? And, you know, as Sela Satterstrom frequently talks about, like the forked tongue too, like the tongue that has learned to fork in order to, you know, articulate multivalent ways of knowing and multiple narratives, right? So, but how do you like give honor and to that, while at the same time there's this kind of suspicion, right? Almost with the categorizing power of language as well. And especially when it becomes inscribed,
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
know, I don't, not that, I mean, this is an ongoing question. I don't know. I don't have an answer for this.
Yeah, I don't know, but it's like, fascinating to think about, and I just like kind of spin in circles, and it's like, there is something that I think is really exciting about language, and it's able to articulate the impossible. And
Hmm.
it's also really limiting, and there are all of these constraints, and language does also create these containers. It does both of that simultaneously. Um, I think the thing that
Hmm.
um, is happening like in this grammar class, for example, but also I think happens when we talk about anything like this is that, how do we like talk about the system or critique the system when all we have is a system, right? Like, how do we talk about the English language through the English language? And I think
Hmm.
about like, there's like the anecdote about there's like the man who is like trapped in like a house, right? And there's no door, and all he has is like a window, and through outside the window he can see the blue sky. And when asked to draw the image of his freedom, he draws the blue window
Hmm.
because that's all he has, right? And so his vision of freedom involves the architecture of his own imprisonment. And so because that's all he can see. And so the idea of escape itself is problematic. And so I think that there's something about like when we're thinking about resisting different systems, whether it's in writing and narrative and language, whether it's in spiritual practices, whether it's trying to get justice right for everything that's happening, is that it can't be in the same way. It can't use the same architecture of what has created those circumstances in the first place, right?
Hmm.
But that's the task, like that's the challenge, and I don't know what the answer is, but how do we see outside, right?
Hmm.
um,
No, and it also occurs to me as you're talking, like, is there a way, like, what if it's flipping it so that it's not necessarily resisting, but actually like accepting, like, oh, there's that, there's space for that too. There's space for that too. There's space for that too.
yeah.
You know, I mean, I know, like, yeah, of course
Yeah.
that makes, oh,
Oh, I think that's about letting go, right? Like I think
mm,
about like Buddhism and non-attachment, right? Is
mm-hmm,
that there's this like, and letting, I mean, I talk about letting go all the time with my good friend Pamela Santos, and she's always like, it's so hard, I know it's so hard. And it is really hard, right? But like for me, when I try to explain what it's about, like letting go isn't actually about like not having desires anymore, right? Like you can
mm-hmm,
still have desires and you can still have goals, but it's when we cling to those and they become attachments, right? That like
mm-hmm,
our whole identity is shaped on that. Like if I don't get into this program, I don't know what I'm going to do. My whole life revolves around me getting into this program, or me getting this job, or me
right,
in this book, or whatever it is. And it's really easy to like lose sight. Like we don't necessarily realize how many things we're attached to in that way, that we're literally like, you know, killing ourselves to hold on to. Um,
yeah,
and letting go isn't to me about letting go of the desires. It's about letting things happen and letting go of the idea of control. Um,
mm-hmm,
and what I learned like this last year was so much letting go for me. A lot of it not voluntary, right? That's usually how like it happens with
yeah,
grief. Things just get taken away and you have to let go. But some voluntary letting go. And what I realize is that what it actually does is it changes my whole vantage point, so that when things actually do happen, it's now that things are happening and the universe is supporting me, rather than, oh, it's this thing that I had to make happen, right?
mm-hmm,
And it's a totally different energetic quality.
mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I would, it's like choosing to see all of it as the miracle,
Hmm.
which doesn't mean that you're, which doesn't mean that you're not going to have, all of the desires and the feelings come up, right? But like, do you get lost in them, or can you like be like, oh yeah, acknowledge, make space for release.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
So, um, let's see. So first of all, I just want to, if anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But also, if people throughout, if there's something like, I would love to hear what you're getting out of this. So even if it's like a word or a sentence or anything like that, you know, feel free to also write that in. I wanted to. So I wanted to also. There's many things I want to ask you about, but um, but let's see. I want to hear more um, about grief, right? So you talk in several of your essays and in your work a lot, and on Instagram too, like a lot about grief. And there's in one of the essays, there's a place where you talk about grief being the, I think it's like a friend sent you um, a quote from Tara Brach, who was quoting like a Lakota Sioux elder about that when someone's in intense grief, they're actually like have the most healing capacity right then. Um, and but it's also like so hard to sit in grief. And also I feel like there's this larger cultural thing where we haven't actually grieved. We're not grieving the pandemic right now and the lives lost, but we haven't even grieved like the so many, hundreds of thousands who have died, you know to making this space that we're on, right? But anyway, I know that gets really big, but can you talk a little bit more about
Yeah, yeah. So that quote was sent to me by my friend by Amanda Ackerman, who texted it
Mhm.
to me, because she had also just lost her cat. So
Mm.
kind of sharing in that grief. And it's also a quote that I've sent to many people since now who have also lost people, animals, companions. And it helped me to be okay with all of the messiness and the pain of being in grief, right? And that it's not just the pain that you're sitting with, but that there's like real and powerful learning that comes from that pain. And and for me, one of the things, I mean, I've talked about this like idea of letting go. I had to learn to let Benny go before he died, right? And it was a lesson that he was teaching me like through the months before. And part of that was because I, you know, knew very much that if I did not let him go, and if I was not visibly okay for him, that he would stick around for my sake, right? In
Mhm.
whatever way that was possible. Um, and so I really needed to be okay actually for him, like so that his I don't know, whatever you want to call like his soul or his, you know, his other self could like go and do his, you know, things, right?
Mhm.
And that was a large part of it. And I think I talk about this in this essay, but one of the things that really, the analogy that really helped me was when I was listening to Sherry Moraga talk at a
Mhm.
conference, and she um, talked about being in the hospital when her newborn son was very sick. And that she realized that her whole body was like in this kind of very shuttered, clenched position,
Mhm.
and that it wasn't a life-sustaining position, and that what she actually needed to do was to have what the life-sustaining and life-giving position is like essentially to be there with your arms open, right? And it's both literal, right? Like I think about this all the time, like when I'm like sitting at my computer and I'm like this, right? Or if I get stressed or if I'm triggered, my response and always is to like shut down and go inwards, right? And then then my body is sore, and then it's like this whole cycle, right? So it's both literal, but it's also metaphorical, right? It's like, how do you continually stay open even when like bad shit is happening, essentially, right? Um, And I think that's one of the lessons is like, we just have to learn to accept the cycles of life and death. Like they're not opposites, right? I think we like think about life and death as opposites. Birth and death are opposites, right? They're two events, but living and dying are actually synonyms. Like where the process of living is also us, the process of us dying well, right? And in that, like, we don't need to have this fear of this event because we're already dying, and it's a totally natural thing, right? And like that's another thing that I learned from trees. Like trees and plants, like they, you know, a lot of trees, not all trees, but like they essentially die every winter, right? And then they're back. And that's just part of it. Like we watch the leaves decay and like rot, and like they become mulch, and then in the spring they come back and they have fruit and we eat it, and then and it's just like the cycle. And that's also humans, but like for some reason we have this like intense fear of the cycle that we're also part of. Yeah.
I fucking love that. And that part in the essay too, where you talk about like, it's like we have one body too. Like why do we resist having this living and dying, this synonymous experience held within one body, you know? So Janice, so when you said earlier that this influences your teaching, and I'm imagining you're teaching not just at workshops, like you're offering a workshop that we'll be putting the link in if people are interested in at the corporeal, like Lydia Yuknovich's corporeal lab or something.
Corporeal writing, yeah.
Corporeal writing, but also at Portland State, right? And so do you, I know that that some of us among in this room also bring in different kinds of practices to the classroom, and that sometimes that students can resist that, but that also that there is this responsibility or obligation to sort of set things up, and then also knowing that like people are going to hear what they're going to hear and they're going to receive what they're going to receive. This semester was the first time that I got like, what does all this new age stuff have to do with writing? So on my evals, but how do you kind of navigate that? This is a very practical question because I'm trying to figure this out too.
Yeah, I mean, I think initially when I first started like having the guts to even start bringing weird things into the class, like I had to put it into a container, right? So I had a seminar that was about plants and personhood. I've taught lots of seminars about trauma, right? And in those containers, it felt like much more natural to be like, okay, we're going to meditate. We're going to do a soul retrieval. We're going to do these things. We're going to do this inquiry or whatever. And then what I realized was like, well, actually, like, we're talking about trauma all the time, right? Whether it's just a regular workshop or that's the topic, like everybody's traumatized always. And so the way in which I was taking care, like for my students and asking them to take care of each other and themselves, like was still relevant in every other class that I taught, right? And so I realized that. I realized that a lot of the kinds of unteachings that I was doing, that like it was all relevant even in this grammar class. Like to me, this grammar class is actually a class about like dismantling everyone's identity. Right? Like I didn't tell them that we're going to dismantle your identities, but that's essentially kind of what it is. And so what I realized is like all of it is connected, because writing isn't just writing, it's like a relationship to language, which is relationship to reality, which is relationship to identity and being, which is relationship to each other. And so all of that is also spiritual practice, whether or not I'm going to call it that. And so anyone who thinks that they are just going to wanting to learn how to like write good dialogue, like okay, but like, and what, like like for what, so I think once I realized that, it made sense. And so that's kind of how I like justify it, is that it's all related, because it's actually just about how to be better humans. And the thing that we're choosing to do in this moment is to write. But it's writing to me is something that's so permeable, like especially depending on what you're writing about, right? Like yeah.
No, absolutely. And so you say that in the classroom too. You're like, this is a workshop. Part of what we're doing is learning about being better humans.
Yeah, I kind of say that. And then also now like students know that I'm like the weird one. And so they
Okay.
talk to each other and they're like, oh yeah, Janice is gonna make you meditate. She's gonna make you like do these things.
See, and I actually
Well,
started
maybe.
bringing in meditation after attending like a anti-racist, like decolonizing the classroom, because it's actually how do we embody other ways of knowing and give them the space in the privileged space of the academy, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's actually like really important to do that. And also like you have to get in touch with yourself in order to make art, y'all, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. So does this feel like a good time to so I'm loving seeing people's comments, and please continue, like if there's a sentence or a word or something, but does this feel like a good time to pull cards?
Mhm.
Okay. So both Janice and I are going to pull a card, and this will be uh, I don't know. I mean, do you feel like there's a particular question brewing, or is it just message for the, not just, but, or is it message for the community?
Yeah, I think it's a message for the community. And I would also say if people have questions inside of yourselves, to just hold that question inside of yourself and to see what yeah, to see how it resonates.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. Okay. Mine popped right away.
I'm laughing at what I drew.
So, do you want to go first?
Sure. So the deck that I'm pulling from is this the animal medicine deck that some of you might be familiar with. And I'll say whenever I draw cards for people or I ask people to draw cards, I think you know, like I will say some things about what I think is coming, but I think one valuable thing too is like what biases and assumptions come to mind for you. So especially with animals, I think people have a lot of assumptions. Like oftentimes I'll have a student and they'll draw like, I don't know, like dragonfly, for example. And they're like, oh, I don't like bugs. And you know, and so like that, or if you draw something, you're like, oh yeah, I love crows. They're amazing. Eyes are on the positive or negative side. I think that that's actually to look into that reaction. Like that reaction, I think actually tells you more information than anything that the card is saying, because there's a narrative in there and that there's actually medicine in there to interrogate your current relationship with something, right? Your resistance or your glorification of. So I'll say that, but the card that I drew was the moose, which I'll
Amazing. Uh-huh.
which, you know, moose. And so in this deck, the moose is a medicine of self-esteem. And like the self-esteem comes from like the power of knowing when you're using good wisdom. But it's also for me like the moose is also an animal of contradictions. And I think that's like what's coming to me most strongly. Like it's an animal that, you know, is very large, you know, and they can seem kind of ungainly, but they're actually quite agile and very speedy. They're very quick, right? They can camouflage themselves really well, even though they're so big. You know, they're I think they're like one of the least social animals, right? Like they're always by themselves except during mating season. And they're usually very quiet. So I think people often think that they're approachable, but they're not necessarily, right? They can be quiet and unassuming, but like, you know, if an action is needed, like they're going to do something about it. And I think part of that is moose apparently have like they're very nearsighted. So they can see very well, and they have good smell and hearing, like other members of the deer family. But they can't see long distances. And that's really interesting to me, right? That they're seeing what's immediately there. And there's a relationship with water that feels important, right? Moose are they're often seen like in lakes, and they're grazing in water. They're born knowing how to swim. They can hold their breath for very long times to graze underwater. They can like close their nostrils, I believe. So yeah, I think there's a lot that's there that's may or may not resonate with your particular question. Yeah, but I always tell people, like, you know, if there's some resonance with the animal, like to sit with it. And then like maybe later you can go Google about the animal, but like to resist the urge to like Google animal facts right away. But like just to sit with, like, you know, how that animal is already maybe in your purview now, right? Or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love that. And also, do you like, so sitting with the animal, noticing whatever the reaction is, but then also Googling, not, so it's like not just like spirit animal facts, but like actually like the like physical embodied realities, like trying to understand that a little bit of that animal actually.
Yeah, because I think when you Google like spirit animal facts, like those are already coming from stories, I think, which are really important, because it's about how these animals are already important to people's cultures. But also I think in like building your own relationship with these animals, to also just like learn more about these animals and who they are. And then that relationship can become much more unique, and it's not just archetypal or symbolic.
Absolutely. Janice, I keep thinking about Pam Orr's book of poetry that we published with Leigh Feig, Grammar of the Cage, which is about working as a zookeeper and thinking about English as the language, as the thing that made it possible for humans to build cages and make zoos to put animals in, right? So in terms of that, sort of the contradictions as well. Yeah. Okay, so I drew, this is a connection, this actually connects the series this evening to the last event that we had together in December, which was on the Feast of St. Lucy. This is the 9 of Cups. I'm using the medieval Scapini deck, which is the deck that I, you know, that I read from for other people. But the reason that this connects to St. Lucy is because St. Lucy's eye is here. I don't know if y'all can see that. Her eye is there. And this card, so this is a card a lot about, well, actually, let me say something a little bit about how I read cards, which is it's like the archive of knowledge, you know, through how other people have interpreted things. But often in a moment, I'm looking at what is sort of shimmering on the card toward me, right? And this right here is, it just, there's a lot about fertility, actually. So, like, I feel like if this is a message to the community that's here, it's sort of like, how can you sit with that which is growing inside, that you haven't been able to make yet, but to trust that the process, you're in that process of incubation, right? You're in that process when the thing that you are moving to express will be born when it is time, right? And and that could be a long period of gestation or a longer period of gestation, but there is actually kind of a message of like, like like it will happen because that's what happens in life. Like you have to, like, it's like the only way that that won't happen is like you start to believe that it won't, and you like kill it, right? as the event, the death event, like the birth event. The birth event will happen, and it's this period of gestation. So I don't know how that resonates, with whatever people's questions. And also that was very different than what you might think of traditionally with the Nine of Cups, which might be about like prosperity and material items and things like that. But this is much more, let me just see one more thing. Yeah, and the other thing, like to tie back to St. Lucy too, is that Lucy was, she's imaged with her eyes on her palms. Like that's what the saint image is, or her eyes holding her eyes on a platter. And so I also think about this as a card about trusting your body as a divination, like as a source of divination, as a source of knowledge, and that sometimes you can know something in other parts of your body much sooner than you know it in your conscious mind, and that your mind might even sometimes get in the way of knowing that. So that's the other kind of message here. Let's see, we do have a question, yeah, to connect the two cards, which is really good, which is how long is a moose's gestation period?
I have no idea. They're a large animal though, so that they tend to be longer, but I don't know exactly. But Teresa, when you were talking about the eye on the platter, I was thinking like so mooses, they can move each of their eyes and ears independently.
Oh.
So there's something, like what came to me was like sometimes you see better when you look away. Which resonating as you were talking. Yeah.
Yeah. And also maybe sometimes you see better when you look in two directions at once. So that kind of simultaneity too. Interesting. Yeah, I love that. Are there any other questions or comments?
There was 2 questions in the chat.
Okay.
Lucy asked, Janice, I wonder what your novel feels like now because you've been shifting your perspective so intentionally.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the novel to me, I mean, I think I rarely felt like with projects like they're complete, but I kind of just feel like it's done. I'm very glad that it's done. And I think because I poured so much into this particular book, I mean, I like literally so much was poured into it. I like also don't have the desire to start another project anytime soon. Like my brain is like, oh yeah, now you can write another novel, and my body's like, no, just go frolic in the meadow and never come back.
Mm-hmm. And the message is saying like, go frolic, like the body message today.
Yeah. So that's like some of me letting go of my like writer identity is that, well, I'm at a particular point in my life where I'm not really doing very much writing, and that's okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Janice, when is that novel coming out again?
In the fall of this year.
Yay. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Somebody wrote.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, Shameka, go ahead and the other question since we only have a couple minutes.
Yeah, there's one more. I think. Let me see. Margaret says, I would love to hear about the legacy of shamanism. When you talked about your mother.
Oh, yeah. So there's not a legacy of shamanism in my family. So in Korean tradition, shamans are usually, I mean, they're usually women. They're in Korean, they're mudang. But you have to be born into it. There's a very like, it's very inclusive, I guess is the word. Exclusive, I don't know. But you have to, you have to be chosen. It comes from a lineage. And from what I know, and there's nobody in my family that's in that lineage. My mother was just someone who just had lots of dreams and visions and would see many things. Like she was a person who would like call me at 3 a.m. because she just sensed that something was going on with me. And oftentimes she was right. Like, I just had a dream that this thing happened. And like, oh, like, and so I think it made it, what that did for me is like it made it okay that people could feel things. And so I think that's one thing that I'm getting more comfortable with is like when something comes to me like an image or a vision or I hear something, my normal impulse would be to keep it to myself, but I'm getting more comfortable with just telling people like, hey, is it okay if I tell you this thing that I just saw that might be relevant to you? But it might not be, but is it okay if I tell you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Um, okay. Well, everyone, I'm gonna make it so I can see the big view of all these different people. It's been so lovely to be here with all of you. Hi, Coco. Hi, Connie. Hi, Sela. Hi, Larkin. Hi, Lucy. You're still here. um, hi, Adrian. Thank you. Hi, Pat. um, so it's lovely, and Vidyu, yeah, and people I haven't met yet. So thank you everyone for coming and spending this time with us. The next second Sunday will be in 2 weeks, and we're going to have Kevin Miguel Garcia, who is a digital pastor and uses and like uh, lives in Atlanta and comes like me from this like intensely evangelical background, but is doing something a whole different way, and has an amazing book called Bad Theology Kills. So I'm excited about that. So hope to see you back in 2 weeks. And then there's other links and things in the chat. And thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Hey, hey, Larkin. So wait, I'm still. Hey, Brenda.
And there's a way for everyone to save the chat if you want to keep some of those links. And I'm sure those are email that'll go out as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good. I think it can save the chat automatically when we record. Oh, we should stop recording.